Let the grasses grow and the waters flow in a free and easy way, but give me enough for the fine old stuff that's made near Galway Bay. Policemen all from Donegal, Sligo and Leitrim too. We'll give them the slip and we'll take a sip of the rare old mountain dew. Skiddery idle idle dum, skiddery idle idle dum, skiddery idum do die day. Skiddery idle idle dum, skiddery idle idle dum, skiddery idum do die day.
The Pure Drop and the Priest's Run. Whiskey is an integral part of Irish heritage, and in olden times anyone who wished could set up a still and go into business. Before there were laws in the land, every castle, mansion and inn could have its own particular extract, and there were all sorts of wonderful blends and flavourings of whiskies distilled. Then came the laws, which demanded licenses and the payment of duty, and with them came elect distilleries. The first laws with regards to distilling were only enforced in towns and in settled parts of the country. Grant's Parliament charged excess on distilling at £1 a gallon. The laws were not enforced in the remote northwest of the country, and the punching stills were developed and thrived as a result. The local constabulary ignored it, and many landlords knew the rent was paid from punching making or from the sale of barley or oats to elect distilleries. The landlords and the gentry loved a good quality drop, and the homemade spirit was often better in quality and flavour than ones of the illegal distilleries. Good quality homemade punching required that much care had to be taken of it in the making. This is how good quality punching was made in the 19th century. Grain, barley, or a mixture of barley and oats was malted by soaking it in spring water until it swelled. The resulting malt was placed in bags beside the open fire until the grain started to sprout. It was then spread out on a clean surface to dry and wash carefully, turned over twice a day to ensure evenness. When dry, it was crushed into a fine meal. Everything had to be very clean and sterile, so as not to contaminate the malt and spoil the process. Boiling water was put into a barrel, and the crushed grain was stirred into it until the substance was fairly thin. This was left for 2 hours, and the mix was strained into another container. This fluid was known as guile or wash. At this stage, the fluid would be lukewarm, and the yeast that had been dissolved in tepid waters was added. The yeast mixture was known as barm. The barrel was left to stand for 2 full days while the liquid began to bubble. It would become still again in 2 more days. When the froth on top of the liquid had gone black, a measure of oatmeal mixed with a measure of sugar and boiling water was thrown in. The mixture would begin to bubble and once again abate. A still was an apparatus used to distill liquid mixtures by heating to selective boil and then cooling to condense the vapor. Stills were made from copper. The stills were placed on a turf fire and was 3/4 filled with the wash. It was stirred continually until it came to the boil. A special head was placed on the still and connected to the worm, and was sealed to stop any steam from escaping. The worm was placed in a barrel of cold water with its lower end forming a tap, and a jug was placed under this tap to catch the fluid that dripped out. Cold water was consistently monitored and replenished when its temperature rose, so the wash could condense in the worm and come out the end in pure drops of singling. The first drops were always shared with the fairies for good luck. This singling would be too strong to drink and had to be ran through the process again. It was put back into the clean still and was sealed up, and the fire relit. The distillation process was repeated, and this was called the doubling. The result was the pure drop. In the northwest of Ireland, the punching makers would run the double through once more for a finer, smoother spirit. This was called the priest's run. The spirit needed to be matured to bring out its best, and this took many months and years in special cases or barrels. Because of the whole process took such a long time, and ordinary people lost interest in it. Nevertheless, the trade of punching making continued to flourish in the remote hills and valleys, where it was difficult to approach without being seen in time to hide the evidence. The smoke from the turf fires was hard hid. The Napoleonic Wars started in the early 18th century and continued for 15 years. As a result, the excess duty increased until 3/4 of the price of drink went on taxes. This led to a revival in the illicit punching making and an intensification on the government's efforts to stop it. Parties of soldiers were often led astray by punching makers who had the whole countryside behind them. The establishment of the Royal Irish Constabulary in 1822 to 1922 made life very difficult for the banned punching makers in the northwest. Members of the force were mostly sons of local farmers and knew all the tricks and hiding places of the punching makers, and knew the countryside very well. A story is told of an evening when two members of the force were on the trail of local punching makers. They found a full wooden barrel of punching in a loft room of a Drumsna farmhouse. One of the men went to get reinforcements while the other sat on the barrel and refused to be distracted by the noises and antics of the woman in the room below. The men of the house all disappeared, even the grandfather that was an invalid. Many hours later, the 4 RIC officers arrived, and they prepared to move the barrel. To their surprise, it was unusually light. The women had carefully bored a hole through the wooden floor of the loft and into the barrel with an auger, and had drawn off the punching. When the barrel was opened, there was no smell of punching, because the woman had squirted paraffin oil up into its empty belly. There is no evidence, no men, and no conviction, and hours wasted. Incidents like this often happened, and made the RIC more alert and more intent on stopping the illicit trade. Consequently, care and time could no longer be invested in making the spirit, and as a result, the quality of the punching declined, and people no longer had a taste for it. There are additives such as lime, treacle, and bluestone that made punching dangerous and unhealthy. The copper stills were replaced by tin makeshifts, and clean copper barrels were replaced by tar cans, oil drums, and other containers not fit for purpose. The age-old skilled craft degenerated in an obscene filth, dishonest botch, condemned by the church, state, and countryman. In 2020, illicit punching making is still happening in Ireland, but on a very small scale. If things were different, this ancient craft and traditional skill could have been harnessed and nurtured legally to become one of Ireland's finest heritages. Now it's part of our heritage, lost forever.
Dum day, skiddery idle diddle dum, skiddery idle diddle dum, skiddery idle dum day, skiddery idle diddle dum, skiddery idle diddle dum, skiddery idle dum day, skiddery idle yum the diddle day, skiddery idle yum dum day.